So welcome to another Experts on Tap series from InSource Solutions. My name is Ted Fluehr, Solutions Architect with InSource. In this session, we're going to talk about integrating System Platform with external databases without a whole lot of scripting or programming. We're going to use something called the SQL Data Object to make that happen. We'll use the SQL Data Grid to be able to see that information on a screen. And I'm also looking into a little bit of SPC reporting. How can we report on this SQL data that we're capturing and storing in a database? So let's take a look at the SQL Data Object in action here. One of the things we do, we have another object here that's going to point to our sample data. So we're going to pull some data from a PLC. We're going to capture things like a work order and things like that. The other thing we're going to do is link to a SQL database. So we're going to make a new SQL database object, and I'll show you how to configure that SQL database object. So one thing you can do, you can have this system create the tables for us. So if I go give it the name of my runtime database and give it the name of my database I'm going to write information to, right? It's going to basically say I'm going to test a connection there. It's going to say that table does not exist. So then I can go configure my table here, and I'm going to go add some different columns and link them to my other object that I have here. So there's the cells and there's the information that I have in my object, and I'm going to add all these attributes, and I'm going to give it the name of the columns of the database that I want. And then what this is going to do when I deploy that, it's automatically going to build. So I'm going right now, I'm linking to my System Platform attributes, and this is how I tie those attributes to a specific column in the database. I'll go rename them in a second. So linking to all my data, the samples are the actual data points that I'm going to be pulling from the PLC. And this example I was using for a customer who wanted to capture some sample data from his different process, store that in a database, and then do some reporting on that. So I'll go ahead and rename these things to match the type of data that I'm pulling from the database. So there's my date time. I'm going to give it the name of this cell, which I'm working on here. I'm going to give it the name of the line. So capturing all that information and sticking all the configuration in this SQL Data Object for the configuration here. So now I'm going to name all these different columns. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to deploy this object. And what's going to happen automatically, it's going to go build this table. So I don't need to know a whole lot of SQL to be able to use this object. I can do all my configuration in System Platform in the object. So now I have all these linked. I have my table definition defined here, and they're linked to my attributes within System Platform. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this down, and there's the actual database name I'm going to try to connect to. I'm going to close this down, check it in. Right? And then what's going to happen when I go deploy this object, I'm going to deploy it, and it's going to go create that table for me inside a System Platform. So I'm going to do a deploy. When the system deploys, it's going to see, hey, this table does not exist yet. So then it will create that table for me automatically. So then let's go take a look in the SQL Server Management Studio and see if it did indeed create that table. Remember, the table name is QADB99. And let's go open up SQL Server Management Studio and go take a look at that. So logging into SQL Server Management Studio here, and I'm going to go see if that database exists. I stuck that into my runtime database. Let's go see if that table now exists. So there it is, a QADB99. Let's design that table, and we'll see what's going on inside that. So there's all the attributes. There's my date time, my cell, my line, my 3 sample values, and my work order location there. So a very great tool where I don't have to know SQL. I don't have to know anything about SQL. I can do all my configuration inside a System Platform in the object, and it's going to open up that information. Here's another one that I previously created, that QADB. If I already have a table created, right, I have another thing that I can do within System Platform. I'm going to make another instance of this SQL Data Object, and I can pull the configuration for my database. So I have 2 options. I can define the tables inside a System Platform, or if I already have them defined in a database, I can have that build the structures inside a System Platform. So I'm going to link to that table when I'm simulating. I already have the configuration complete. So we're going to go link into that QADB. I'm going to test the connection, make sure, and that database and that table does exist. So then if I go to design, I say get from table. So now it pulled the information from the database. And now what I need to do also is now link it to attributes, right? So it defined the column names, but now I'm going to go link them to the attributes in my object table to be able to link those two things together. So linking all those same properties that I did before, but I was doing it in opposite direction. I was configuring inside a system platform. Now I configured it inside of the database and brought the configuration in from the database. Now I'm doing a link to the actual object. So you have your choice of whether you want to do the configuration of the database inside a system platform, or you want to create the tables, or maybe you already have a table created inside of a SQL Server database and you want to link that information. You can pull that information in and it's going to join those two tables. So this is the kind of where the rubber hits the road here. I'm linking my SQL table to my attributes within System Platform to make that connection. Then I go query that database based on what information I would have. So the way we read and write information from this SQL data object, we execute some commands, right? So we have a SQL database we want to read, we want to write from, and then we can have some attributes that are linked to in my object, and I have these commands called attribute to db append or to db replace, and it's going to populate that data. I also have the ability to push that information to a temporary buffer, so I can execute the attribute to temp command, and it's going to put database or data in a temporary buffer, and then I can push the data from a temporary buffer into my database. Also, to extract the information, I have some commands that I can use to extract the information. So I can pull the information out and put it into a temporary buffer, and then I can write the temporary buffer to actual object attributes, or I can go directly from my database. Executing the db2 attribute command, it's going to pull the information from my database and write that directly into object attributes inside a system platform. The other thing you can do here is you can delete records, and you can select the next records if you're trying to step through the database, select the next or previous, and you can delete records using some of these commands inside that SQL data object. So it's got a lot of power. I don't need to know a lot of SQL code to be able to do this. I can use the SQL data object to do all the heavy lifting behind the scenes, executing SQL commands for me without worrying about that. So here's a list of those commands. If I go look here, there are all the different commands that we just discussed. Attribute to db command, temp to attribute command. So these are all the commands I have available to me. And via scripting, I can trigger these commands to write information to a database. So let's go take a look at some of that scripting that I have here. So if I look at the scripts tab in my sample object I have here, what this is going to do is take the information out of my attributes inside a system platform and write these information to a PLC, or from the PLC to that. So there's my trigger from PLC, and this is the little command I have. I have little bits here. When this PLC trigger bit gets on true, what I'm doing here, I'm simulating a work order just to have some information in my database. But the real meat of the system here is when I'm executing this attribute to db command. I'm setting that to 1. That's going to fire off the command to insert this record inside my database when that bit gets triggered. So I'm using that inside a system platform. So I have a little sample test screen here, so you can see there's a work order number right there. But if I trigger this PLC right, it's going to read those simulated variables from my simulation module, and you can see it generated that work order. If I do it again, it's going to put that 61. This is where I'm reading that work order back from the database. Work order, 961 is the one I'm coming back from. So if I execute a query inside my database, you'll be able to see those variables got actually written into my database right there. Those 958 and 961, those attributes just got written in when I execute that command. And that could be a bit coming up from your PLC. In my case, I'm just simulating it from a command button on my HMI screen. So it's a great way to see the information. So I also have the ability to read information. Now, you need to pass in, what are you going to key off of? What is the actual value you're going to key off? What's your primary key? In this case, it's the work order. So if I want to pull the information about a work order, if I execute this command, this db2 attribute, it's going to pull the information from my database and bring it into my attributes. The previous one was executing from my attributes. So now, there's the work order. If I do a read db, that's the work order that's in the buffer, and I say read database, it's going to go find all the information about work order 961. There's the sample data from that work order, and I can see the information. I can also change that number. Let's say I want to go get a different work order, put in 955 as my work order. So now that's going to be the key. And I execute that read command from that script. It went and pulled that information from my database. So you can see not a whole lot of scripting going on. I'm just using the functionality of that object to go pull the information from the database. So the other thing I can do is I can go, look at this datasheet view. If I'm doing some testing and setting this thing up, I can do a refresh here, and it's also going to pull all those different samples that were written just for me to do some diagnosis and troubleshooting with my data. There's all those different work orders and all the raw simulated data that I have here from the database. So it's just another way to pull the information while you're in the development mode to see what the data is inside of my database. So let's go take a look at another tool here. It's called a SQL Data Grid. I can use this SQL Data Grid to go extract information. So it's a graphical. It's an orchestra graphic or an industrial graphic. I'm going to drop that into a graphic editor here, and I'm going to go configure some custom properties I have here. One thing it needs to know is what's the name of my database, what's the name of the server, in my case localhost, and what's the name of the table that I'm going to go pull the information from. So there's those QADB is the actual table name. If you want to do some more SQL code here, you want to do some where clauses in there, you can do that also. But if you just put the table name, it's going to go extract all that information from the database using this SQL Data Grid. So let's go see that in action here. So if I go click on that SQL Data Grid screen here, and I go do a test, I want to make sure I have a good connection to my database. That'll look good. Then I do a retrieve. It went and pulled all that information from my database. So there's all the records right now that I have in my database that I've been simulating here, and that's that latest work order, 967 is the latest work order I have here. So, if I go trigger a few more of those writes there, so triggering a couple of those writes into the database, and couldn't do that because I wasn't logged in there. So let me go here and log in. I didn't have the rights to do that. So let me go trigger that again. And if I trigger that one more time, doing a couple of extra writes into my database. Let's go take a look at the grid and see indeed if we do have that information now stored in my database. So let's do a retrieve the information, go down there, and now you can see those latest variables coming in, the 970, 73, and 76 were records that were just inserted from my system. So, System Platform is triggering the rights to a database. So in the real world example, I have a customer wants to take some samples based on some trigger coming up from the PLC. He can do that with the SQL data object. It's going to extract the information and stick it into the database. The other thing this customer wanted to do is they wanted to be able to generate some reports on this, some SPC type reports. So we're storing all this information inside our database. Let's go configure how we look at different reports. So I need to point to a SQL Server database, and you can see there's my runtime database I'm pointing to. There's my QADB is the name of my table, and I'm going to do a test connection. So this reporting package will go connect to those tables that I just created and go pull the information in. So I need to point to that database first, and I have some SPC functionality here. So you go configure your SPC configuration here. There's the 3 different values that I'm pulling in from my database, right? There's the SQL table, sample 1, 2, and 3, and you can see how many samples I'm going to read per chart point there. I'm going to do 3 sample counts, and there's my specification limits and things like that. So I'm going to sample that data and chart that information on some different SPC type charts. So the first one I have here is the histogram report. So if I look at the histogram report, I can go point those to those same tables, right? I can go point that to my same database points, those 3 sample points. I'm going to go look at the last 2 hours. You can define what time frame bar is, and then you can see that information in a bar chart. So let's go take a look at this in a runtime report. Also, there's my X bar chart, looking also at 2 hours, and there's my same SQL parameters here. I'm going to go look at my target, my upper or lower control limits, and put that information on the screen and tell it what rules you want to apply to this SPC chart. So all this configuration is done in the reporting package, and then here's another X bar chart that I'm putting on the system, and then this one here is going to be the range chart. So I can plot the information from my database, and I can look at the SPC parameters associated with that range chart here. So let's go take a look at these in runtime, and then we'll look at this information to see how these charts are coming out from the sample data that was triggered from a PLC bit, and using that information within System Platform to write the information to a historical database table. So let's execute this project. I'm going to run the project. I'm going to go down here, and I'm going to connect to that histogram report. I'm going to generate this report, and I'm going to open up that report, and we'll see here that there is that indeed histogram that indicates it's sample 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that's a histogram of the data. It looks kind of strange because it's not normal data. It's just kind of simulated data, so you don't see a typical bell curve as you would there, but it's showing you the histogram type report. Let's go look at that X bar chart here, and we'll see that information generated from the database. So there's those 3 different samples, and we're putting that on a bar chart in an SPC type format with the upper spec limits and lower spec limits shown there on the chart. The last one we had here is an X bar and R chart, so we'll go generate that chart, generate that as a PDF, and then we'll look at that information in this this report here. So now it's coming up there. So the X bar and the R on the bottom moving range chart showing that information. So it's a great tool to be able to go very easily extract information from your PLC, use System Platform, write it to the system, and you go from there. So that's pretty much all we had today, folks. Thanks for sitting in on this session. If you have any questions, you can please contact me at the email address on the screen. Thanks again. We'll catch you on the next Xperts on Tap session.